Good morning, everyone. We're so excited to be able to have this conversation together today. It is May 3rd, and we are right in the mix of what is a really powerful and busy week for many in our communities, with it being the National Week of Remembrance and Awareness for missing and murdered Indigenous relatives and missing and murdered Indigenous women, people. And so today we want to just have this little conversation as we know that, May 5th is the day where many people are going to be hosting walks and art events and just collaborations and connections and ceremony together to really be both remembering those who are currently missing and those who we have lost, as well as really just trying to bring broader awareness and equal focus on when so many in our families go missing. And so today we have a few folks with us. I will introduce myself and then we'll just kind of have this conversation. I'll have them introduce themselves afterward or after I do mine. I am Jolene Engelking. I am Eagle Clan. My family is from the White Earth Nation here in Minnesota. I am the National Tribal Sexual Assault Resource Center coordinator here at MUSAC, and that is what is allowing us to really come together to kind of dive deep into this conversation and explore those intersections of sexual violence and MMIW and what we can do. I am just really thankful to be here today with two of my colleagues. Nicole, would you introduce yourself?
Sure. Buju Nendanoe Maganang, Nicole Matthew Jaganashimong, Manidu Baneshi Indigo, Migaziento Dame, Gawa Baba Ganakag in Dunjba. Greetings, relatives. My English name is Nicole Matthews, and my Indian name means Spirit Bird Woman. I'm also Eagle Clan, and my family is also from the White Earth Nation in Minnesota. I'm the executive director at the Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition. I also served as the vice chair of Minnesota's Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Task Force, and I'm the chair of our MMIWR Reward Fund board in Minnesota. So really honored to be here with you all today.
Ingrid.
Good morning. My name is Ingrid Anderson. I currently serving as MUSAC's National Policy Director. I'm working with Jolene on the National Tribal Sexual Assault Resource Center. And it is an honor to be here and an honor to be talking about this important topic today.
And Ruth, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you. G'dagute Sigids, good morning. Madashi Mia Adesh heads, Mabe Sigids, Madzigidads Nakbaga O, Madashi Ruth Madegadi heads as well. I'm Ruth Buffalo. I carry my late grandmother Ruth's English name and her Hidatsa name, Woman Appears. I'm an enrolled citizen of the Mandan Hidatsa and Arikara Nation, and I'm originally from Mandaree, which is located on the Fort Berthold Indian Reservation in western North Dakota. I'm dialing in from the Minnesota Indian Women's Resource Center. I stepped into the new role of CEO on March 4th, and it's good to be here in this virtual space with all of you to discuss an important topic. Madzigidads, thank you.
Almost 2 months exactly that you've been in your role. And so kind of just to start out, I've been really thinking a lot lately about how, I started as an advocate. I was first trained, I think I did the math of like 19 years ago, right? And it's something that even when I was first initially trained, the people that weren't talking about MMIW. It was just not something that was mentioned in like broader context. And one of the things that is, it is heartbreaking that there has to be so much awareness. It has been a really beautiful thing to see more and more people really acknowledging the endemic and epidemic that's happening within our communities, and both the collective pain and loss that happens, as well as that impact on those individual families and loved ones. And so, with MMIW, growing, the awareness growing so dramatically over the last, 5 to 10 years, I was wondering if folks could talk a little bit about, what do you think kind of brought about this this growth and attention and awareness, as well as maybe what was that moment or what were those moments that really led you to realize that this is not just, those things that are happening within our individual families or in our communities, but really a lot bigger than all of us. I don't know who'd like to go first.
I mean, I think one of the things that has led to like an increase in attention has been social media and the push to like get our stories out on social media, right? Because for many years we weren't seeing our stories or our cases in the media. And so, people have been successful in utilizing social media to share those stories and get them out in a broader way. I think also, tribes have a unique status within our nation. Like it's we're sovereign nations. We have a government-to-government relationship with the US government. And so there has really been also a push on from our tribal leaders to our federal government to really do more, to be more responsive, to be more accountable to the first people of this land. And so I think, and then I think there's been, some pretty significant cases that we have seen. And I know, Ruth, that, is also some of the impetus for how you entered some of the work around missing and murdered. So.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for the question. And I agree with everything that Sister Nicole has shared. We're as Indigenous peoples or the first peoples of these lands, we're born into this unique political relationship with the United States federal government. And unfortunately, many of us have stories and lived experience that aren't so good stories, that we've experienced within our family histories, and maybe even within before being born, with the traumas and violence that maybe our mothers and grandmothers have experienced. And so it's a heavy topic for sure, and it hits close to home. And so many of us, I think, stepped forward when we saw, our younger sister, the late Savannah LaFontaine Graywin, go missing in Fargo, and it really, really opened our eyes. I mean, we all know and see what happens in each of our respective communities with the lack of response and the lack of coverage. And to see a young working mom, she was a CNA and she was preparing for the birth of her young daughter, and she was 8 months along in her pregnancy, just really shook so many of us. I think the entire country, throughout Indian country, shook us to the core. So we just took action because we didn't want this to happen again, and we wanted to push for accountability. And Savannah, it resonated with us too, living off the res, being from, a tribal community such as Fort Berthold Indian Reservation, and then living off the res. It just, oftentimes we feel like we have to fend for ourselves, and so we just came together as a collective, but everything was, grounded and came from conversations surrounded in and around ceremony. We talked to a lot of different community members, but the idea for us to just form a local task force, local coalition, those conversations were held, right outside a sweat lodge, area in Fargo. So, just thinking of ways to help and how we can continue to center, those closest to the pain, which is the families, and to never forget their loved ones' names, and to always be pushing for that family-centered, survivor-centered approach is so important. So, Ziggy, thank you.
Ingrid, was there anything you'd like to add to this conversation?
Let's say one of the most beautiful parts of even this conversation is the connection. And I think one of the legacies of colonization is like secrecy and shame, and thinking that maybe the pain, the trauma that our own families have experienced is something that is just ours, and we're responsible to keep it, maybe to not talk about it, not share it. And I am just so encouraged even to hear this conversation again about about sharing and about honoring the stories of our own families, our own ancestors, our sisters, even, our, fellow community members, because that's our true kinship responsibility. Like, that's being in good relationship with each other. And we know that, violence thrives in silence and in shame. And in order to overcome that, we have to be talking about these things. In order to interrupt these patterns, we have to start by talking about it. And so thank you for sharing Savannah's name. Thank you for sharing that story. And I love the cry when we have our marches, when we have our gatherings of, say their name, say her name. We want to hear the name. We want to honor the name, honor the story. And even when there's legislation passed that comes because of a hard fought, because of hard fought advocacy and community organizing, I think of your work, Ruth. I am always encouraged when we're able to attach a name to that legislation and able to honor that story by saying we're exercising our tools to interrupt these patterns.
Thank you for that. And that's the thing, like, well, there has been, more and more awareness and more attention. We all know that this has been going on in our communities since contact, right? We know this, and we know how many families have just, not even talked about things, right? Even in my own family, I found, like, it was just, I think last year where I finally got somebody whisper to me, they're like, oh, did you not know that somebody was murdered in our family? And I'm like, how did I not know this? As somebody who's doing this work and who has good relationships with my family, it's like, oh, because people didn't talk about it, because that pain is so raw, even decades and decades and decades later. And what does that mean with how we raise our children and how we communicate? And what does safety look like even within our own family structure? And so thank you all for that. Kind of the title of this, and some of the thing I've also been really kind of wanting to just talk more and more about is how so often we, like, within this work, we end up getting like hyper focused or like very like specialized in our different work, which is beautiful because we need people who are experts on different things. But I've had a lot of people asking kind of recently, and some folks coming with curiosity and some folks sometimes coming in a challenging way, talking with me about how, or asking why, is sexual violence related to MMIW? People want to keep them very separated out, when in fact, well, not all, I don't believe that all MMIW is related to sexual violence, but there are large overlaps. And there's things that we, particularly, our sexual assault advocates and those who are doing that response, need to learn and talk about more. And so I was wondering if folks could share a little bit about, like, what do you see as those overlaps or intersections between sexual violence and MMIR?
I mean, I think it's really important to look at these issues and how they intersect with gender-based violence, right? Because when we look at Native women who've gone missing or who have been murdered, there is almost always that intersection with gender-based violence, right? And the ways that our women are targeted for this violence. And often, sexual violence is also at the heart of that, and the ways that our women are objectified in many different ways long before it ever gets to that, right? Like, we can see all the different ways that we are objectified. And when you can objectify a person, you can see them as less than human, as more disposable and easier to harm. And Native women are objectified all the time. We are, Halloween costumes, and we are our likeness is used for advertisements where we have, virtually nothing on. And so I think it's really critical that we look at what those intersections are. with sexual violence, with sex trafficking, and as well with domestic violence as well. If we look at homicide rates of women, it's almost always intersecting with domestic violence as well. And so, I think it's important to stay focused on that and to look at how it really does intersect with gender-based violence, because it is different than other types of crime, right? It's different. It's different when we look at other things. And sometimes it's even different if we look at, we have broadened this conversation around missing and murdered Indigenous relatives, because we also recognize that our men and boys go missing and are murdered, and our LGBTQ two-spirit relatives go missing and are murdered. And though in cases of our male identified relatives, it's not always the same intersections. And so, I do think it's important to lift that up and to look at then how are we addressing sexual violence? How are we addressing gender-based violence, sex trafficking, and to find solutions to those that may also impact this issue.
Ruth, yeah, I completely agree. And a lot of things that come to mind to me for is like looking, at the exactly what our sister Nicole shared is, the getting to the root causes, like I think we all believe and can agree that the narrative hasn't changed from, point of first contact, and how the normalization of violence against the original peoples of these lands has continued, so much that the model that was developed here, by the United States federal government is replicated throughout the globe, and so I think, looking at the root causes of violence rendered against our peoples is so important when we look at finding solutions and the connection to the harm that is occurring every day against, towards Mother Earth. And we could look at, the intersections of the extractive industry and all that comes with it in harming others, harming the planet, harming water, air, land, is directly connected to how we treat one another. And so it's some of the thoughts that come to mind, and also looking at the historical context of the harmful federal policies, such as the boarding schools and residential schools, the complete disregard for our children and the separation of families and the hiding of our bodies, so yes, there's just so much to unpack and uncover, but it's definitely a courageous conversation that needs to be talked about. So Madzigidads, thank you.
Mm-hmm. I was thinking about, when we were doing our Garden of Truth research with Native women who were used in prostitution and trafficking, one of the women told a story about a sex buyer who wanted her to role play that she was Pocahontas and he was John Smith. And when I think about that, like it's so telling, right? Because Pocahontas was our first documented case of MMIW. She was not a grown woman that willingly was, fell in love and went to this faraway country. Like she was a child. And, if we look at our own children that are around that same age, who you cannot fathom that she would be willingly, okay with going to this other country and married off to this much older white man. And so it's very it was very eye-opening of the views of people and how they look at us. And through that research, another sex buyer said to a woman, "I thought we killed all of you." And so to think of the violence behind those words and just the sentiments that people are thinking when they see us, and that's if they even see us, because many people think we just don't exist anymore. They think we are not even here. So yeah.
It's a good point. I was going to mention really quick, it reminds me too of like the forced sterilization of our women, you know, against their consent, or, you know, it's just, I mean, the list goes on and on. And, you know, you think of like back home on Fort Berthold Indian Reservation too, you know, with the Missouri River, how, you know, through another federal policy of the Pick-Sloan Act, you know, that flooded 94% of our agricultural land. And my mom's peoples, they're, you know, historically agricultural people. And but then the powers that be then sort of tried to switch the narrative and say, well, we made this man-made lake as a result of the Garrison Dam, so we're going to call it Lake Sakakawea, but it's really should be called a reservoir. But you know, they sort of portray this false narrative that it's, you know, honoring a woman, but after such destruction was, you know,
Yep.
forced upon us, you know, so it's interesting we have to, you know, sort of read between the lines and ask questions. So I'd encourage our future generations to, you know, do your research and ask questions and show up, you know, at various meetings in every level of government, or, you know, stay active in your community, but for sure kind of read between the lines, you know.
Mhm. Exactly. Point.
I so appreciate what you're talking about with the parallels between the woman's body and the land. And we as Indigenous women know our connections. We know our role in, in society, in our community, in all of creation. And I just often think about the parallel between the trespass and exploitation of the land and the trespass and exploitation of the female body and the female experience. And I think that kind of connects back to me about the privilege of being able to share our own stories, and the great responsibility to share the stories of women who, whose stories we carry. And I often think about a quote that was shared with me once, that the colonizer would love to say at some point, like, look at them, look what they're doing to each other, as if to say that we are perpetrating exploitation against each other. We're perpetrating violence and these horrors against each other, and to stand back and absolve themselves of responsibility. And so I appreciate your call to action, Ruth, to be engaged and to see that all of these things do overlap. There is not a policy, there is not a conversation about land, about natural resources, about any creation that is not connected to the welfare of our women. And I think even your comments about the boarding schools connect back to, I think, the sexualization and the abuse of children, again, exploited as something that can be taken, can be controlled, can be managed. And until we address that as the truth, we're going to be saying we're doing prevention work. We're going to be saying we're in community, we're carrying these stories, but we're always going to be reacting. We're going to struggle to get to the true prevention, and to be able to respond and to get ahead of things, instead of having to react to another horrible story, another federal policy that destroys our lands, and makes it seem as if we are somehow responsible for these things. So Ruth, I just am kind of wondering, actually, for both you and Nicole, what strategies have you seen successful to be able to respond instead of react, or to initiate a conversation, or to be involved before we are in that reactionary position, just out of curiosity?
Well, I mean, I think it really depends on like the situation, right? And so I think the strategies that I've seen to be most helpful in really creating change is one, involving our elders and our tribal leadership, and really working on it from that government to government relationship, but also the involvement of community, and our young people, and and everything, I think, through prayer. And people will use all kinds of different tactics, right? Like I have seen, the strategies that I might use, um, have been maybe less combative, but there are people who are out there who take a much different approach, and it's working, right? And it's helpful because that also helps to move the needle, and it also helps to create change, because those people that are out there that are yelling and screaming and really pushing in more forceful ways are also getting the attention, and people are listening, right? They're forced to listen. And so I think it takes all of that. So I guess what I'm saying is there is no right one strategy, because it takes all of that and all of the people in our community. And so, years ago, we had done a series of interviews and videos and things on, activism and what is activism. And there's those who are working to change policy, right? And sometimes people who are working with policymakers, that takes a certain level of diplomacy to have those conversations, and where people aren't getting shut down or ignoring you. Because sometimes when we get in those spaces, there's a certain way to communicate so you don't shut people down. But then there's also the people who will take to the streets and do sit-ins or do protests. We can see several people protesting all across the country right now for various issues, right? And then there are people that you call like the keyboard warriors, who will sit on their computer and who will like research stuff and send all this stuff out and post all over social media. And then there's people who will be out in community and in prayer in our sweat lodges, who will be praying for those who are out in the streets. And so I think it takes all of that. I think those are all, important and critical strategies that are helping to move us in a good direction.
This is Ruth. Yeah, I would agree as well. To our sister Nicole has shared, it's going to take all of us to make change, and whether it's, big or small, however that's defined, just making change from where you're at, or trying to make a difference from where you're at, whether it's, a simple like or a share on social media, or a one-on-one conversation with, someone who has different views from yourself, or I think of our allies too, just starting at ground zero and maybe having them, having allies have one-on-one conversations or kitchen table conversations within each of their respective families, because as our sister Nicole said, it's going to take all of us, and not one person can help end the crisis that we're facing today. It's ongoing, and it's going to take all of us. And I believe as a collective versus, a hierarchical singular structure, we need to continue to come together as a collective, because as our sister Nicole shared, everybody has their unique special strengths, and we need to capitalize on that, and find ways to continue moving the needle, of justice forward, so I think of again like that story of the three sisters walking along, we'll say the Mississippi River, and they saw these babies floating down the river. So the two sisters jumped in the water, and they started doing like a assembly line of getting the babies out of the water and onto the shore. And then the third sister was walking up the shoreline, and the two sisters were like, "Hey, where are you going? Get back here and help us." And the third sister was like, "I'm gonna go further upstream and find out, who's putting these babies in the water, or why are these babies, being put in the water." So I just always think of that in terms of, I think we all kind of are so familiar with like that crisis mode, and how do we, move from that mindset, or even the scarcity mindset, move to more of a place of abundance, and thriving and, proactive approach. But I really like I'm glad and happy to hear of the talk of like our culture and how do we, I think there's a big push for like culture as prevention, and it's things that our ancestors already, they knew and prayed about and left those teachings for us, that have those teachings have withstood the test of time, and they're here for us, to continue to use to help heal, ourselves, our families, and our communities. But I just really love the beautiful talk of, coming together as a community, staying true to our values, all rooted in community, and our values of being good relatives, good ancestors. I think are really helpful ways to make sure that we're coming together, all of these different movements and efforts, are, I believe, rooted in prayer and love, but we also have to make sure that once these new laws get passed or these bills become laws, then the other piece is enforcement or implementation, enforcement, and then evaluation, because we can't always trust that. Yeah, I know every state in the United States is different and the political landscape is different, but we can't always trust that others are working in our best interest. It's something I learned as a new lawmaker when I was in North Dakota, is that once these bills became new laws, then we have to follow up and make sure it's not just sitting on the shelf, or just like the Not Invisible Act, the final report full of recommendations. We have to make sure that it's, more than just a report, more than just looking good on paper, words on paper. We got to make sure that we follow through to the end to make sure that those recommendations are implemented, so it's the work is ongoing. The work never ends.
Right.
And so kind of with that, there have been like so many good things. So both with the awareness and some of the things that are happening on the tribal, local, state, federal level, that will hopefully, I mean, I know I truly honestly don't know like in the short term, like what has some of the impact really been, but it seems like there's a lot of things that are being really primed to create some lasting change for our communities, right? Both in that response side of things, and then hopefully just in general, how we're best able to, be changing our communities and to be, not allowing this to happen anymore. And I was wondering if people could talk maybe about some of those strategies that have seemed to be successful at this point, or things that, were at least like, I mean, so Nicole, as she'd mentioned earlier, was part of, some of the wonderful work at our Minnesota legislature to really kind of be creating that change. And I know there's been work that's done federally. And so could y'all talk about some of that, like some of the good things that we're seeing movement on?
Yeah, I mean, I think Minnesota has been, a leader in some of our work around these issues, and, having our, the first permanent office with permanent state funding for the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Relatives Office, and also for the Missing and Murdered Black Women's Office, which is also the first of its kind in the nation. I think that's really incredible to have these two offices that are able to really focus on addressing this issue and the many issues in our communities, and to work in community and to look at how we're tracking these cases. The MMIR office is, we now have a reward fund, and so we're starting to see people with the new license plates around the state. That's generating income for that reward fund, so we can continue to grow that. And I think that's really incredible, and a way to help us. And sometimes when we look at our responses to things, and we look at those changes, like it can also lead to long-term, to prevention. And so when we look at policies can lead to prevention, because when we start changing how people have to respond to these cases, over time, hearts and minds also start to change, because we are forced to change how we are responding in community into these cases, right? So like we've seen that in many other situations. We've seen it with smoking. We've seen it with seatbelts and car seats and many other things. Like we wouldn't even think of not putting a child in a car seat anymore. And so we've seen how policy can change hearts and minds. And so I think we've had some really significant policies in Minnesota, but also on the federal level. And so I would love to hear you, Ruth, talk about the NIAC Commission and the work that was done through that, which I think is really incredible. And also, I am sure, much like when we were doing the interviews for the Garden of Truth research, was probably really hard to listen to our relatives who talked about, such heartbreaking losses and things that they had gone through.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, the Not Invisible Act Commission, we're told that it's the most, to date, it's the most diverse commission within the federal government's history, because it was comprised of an equal amount of non-federal representatives like myself. And so we had 6 different subcommittees. I was a co-chair alongside a federal partner. And so the subcommittee that I co-chaired with, our subcommittee covered jurisdictions, prosecution, and information sharing. And there were 6 different subcommittees, 2 that focused on law enforcement in general, and then another one on law enforcement recruitment and retention. And then the other was data collection, legislative and administrative changes, jurisdiction, information sharing, prosecution, and then victim services. And they all, as you all know, they all or overlap, and they're interconnected. And it was a process that was, I believe, designed to be over 2 years that we would come together. But of course, the pandemic sort of messed with the duration of that, but of the period of coming together. And so we were able to meet, regularly virtually, and then we hosted 7 field hearings across the country. And then at each of those field hearings, we also were able to visit, different agencies and organizations, through site visits. 7 of the locations included Flagstaff, Arizona, Albuquerque, New Mexico, Billings, Montana, Blue Lake, California, Anchorage, Alaska, and I believe there's Minneapolis, Minnesota. But we did spend 7 days in Alaska, where we held field hearings in Anchorage for 2 days, and that, I believe, was about a 12-hour day, from start to finish of field hearings, because we wanted to make sure that we could hear everyone who made the time to show up. A lot of people traveled from very remote villages. We also spent a day in Bethel, and then we also went to the village of Emonic, and then Ketchikan. And as you mentioned, it was very heart-wrenching, to hear directly from the community members and families who are directly impacted, in a large amount of men, grandpas, uncles, brothers that were present, so it was really heart-wrenching, and there was a very strong intersection of sexual assault that was provided in the testimony. And so we tried our best to make sure that we were, holding the community in the best way we could, in trying to capture the heart of the families who were directly impacted, but we also wanted to provide supports during those hearings, to make it less of a rigid courtroom style setting. We tried to incorporate, bring in drum groups from each of the respective communities. And when we came to Minneapolis, it was really, really beautiful, because we were kind of nearing the end of our field hearings. I think after Minneapolis, we had Billings, Montana. But at that point in time, we were, as commissioners, pretty overwhelmed with the information that we were receiving, and many of us were having dreams of a lot of the stories and direct accounts that were shared from family members. And so when we came to Minneapolis, it was really beautiful, really healing. The community came together, and the grandmas and aunties came and brought their medicines, and the women's hand drum group came, you know, and they have a beautiful story too. You know how like once they receive sexual assault advocate training, they receive a hand drum, you know, and so there was just so much healing that took place. But it was important to hear from the families and the efforts, you know, that went forward, you know, as a result for the Not Invisible Act Commission. Of course, it's not the be all end all, but you know, this wouldn't have been possible had two nope, I have my door open, sorry. These efforts wouldn't have been possible had we not had two Native women in Congress, you know,
Yes.
because these are ongoing issues. And of course, it's not the be all end all, but it's a start, you know, it's a step in the right direction. And we hope that the recommendations are implemented, but we need the community also to rally behind this report, to make sure it's not just, you know, another report sitting on the shelf and a good gesture of bringing people together. You know, we want tangible results. We want to see outcomes. We want action. And so with that, the commission did call for a decade of healing and a decade of action. Again, as you mentioned, we look to our brothers and sisters north of the medicine line in Canada, because they're leading the way on a lot of the things that we're dealing with today, you know, with residential boarding schools and the MMIW movement. And so we know Canada has called for, you know, a decade of healing, you know, action too. So we want the same here. We want, you know, we're pushing for accountability and trying to help prevent further tragedies from happening. But, you know, every single Native person here, you know, we deserve to live a good, healthy, long life like the next person, you know, because our life expectancy, unfortunately, has been very low, you know, for a number of reasons. But anyhow, so that's some of the thoughts that's on my heart and mind right now is making sure that these efforts, you know, go forward, you know, because it's where we're carrying all of those stories of all of the families who are still suffering, who may not have answers, who are still waiting for their loved ones to return. I'll just say real quickly, I was at a corn peoples gathering at the Yazzie farm in Chinle, New Mexico, and this past August, end of August. And I saw one of the women who provided testimony in the Albuquerque field hearing, and she had shared with me that her brother returned, like they were able to find her brother alive, you know, and that he was in pretty rough shape, but you know, he had been missing for a number of years, you know, so it was my first time ever hearing, you know, sort of a success story or you know, the family being reunited, which was really amazing to hear. So yeah, I don't want to ramble on too much, but those are some of the thoughts that are coming up on my heart and mind. Madzigadads, thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for your work on that. I think it was, you know, like sitting and listening to our relatives just tell such really horrific things that happen to their family is hard. It's hard to listen to that. And also knowing that these are our relatives, right? Like these are our communities. And so I know firsthand, because I felt it when we did the Garden of Truth research. It really takes a toll on your spirit and your heart. So Chimigwich for doing that work and for carrying those stories and working to create change. And I think you brought up two really important points that I thought about, and one was that representation really matters. Like it really matters when we have our people in places of leadership that can really get things done, get policy done, like create these commissions. So, you know, we have Deb Haaland in one of the highest positions in the federal government that any Native woman has ever sat on. And so that really matters. It really matters to have her there to really push and to make sure that that things are getting done, that we're addressing these issues, that that there's attention to Indian country and what's happening to our people. You know, and we're really lucky to have that in Minnesota also, right? With our Lieutenant Governor, Peggy Flanagan, who is always a champion for us in our communities and really pushes to make sure that we have that visibility, and has changed things so that forever, like, tribal nations have to be consulted here in Minnesota. Like, that really matters, right? Like, that should have been done for a long time. But from here on out, we will have that, where our tribal nations will be consulted on issues in the state of Minnesota. And then the other thing is, like, really looking to our relatives to the north, and to all the work that has been done in Canada, because they did this many years ago. And I think we can learn a lot from them. We too, in our task force in Minnesota, had listened to, had them come and speak to us, so we could learn about what worked really well, but also, like, what the missteps were in their work. And one of the things we really took away from that was that we didn't want to just do a report with recommendations or mandates, or whatever, but, like, we needed to have an implementation plan. We need to have action, right? Because we don't, like you said, you don't want it to be just a report that's sitting on someone's shelf. We really need that to move into action. So how are we creating action steps from that, to ensure that it keeps moving forward and doesn't just sit there? Because how many times have we seen, commissions happen and different things happen, and then we get a report, and then people talk about it for a little bit, and then it goes away, right? Like, we want long-term change. It's not about, it's never about the report. It's always about, how is it leading to action, long-term action? So thank you.
Ingrid, any thoughts?
I guess this just leads me to have more questions. I always have more questions than answers. I hope that's always the way. But I guess, two questions. Future leadership here.
Yes.
I have two questions maybe we don't have answers for, but that I've thought about for as long as I can remember, and I'm sure they are in the front of everyone's mind, is, how do we make this, the crisis of our missing relatives, our missing women, be an issue that is not just a woman's issue? And how do we make it that it is not a partisan issue? Because I think in order to sustain long-term funding, long-term support, we need it to be a whole community response. I don't know if anybody has an answer or a thought on that, or tools that we can take to move forward, or maybe it's just a question to keep in our minds. As I develop this policy, as we have these conversations, how do I make it where we are addressing that, we're working to answer that? I'd love to hear any thoughts if anyone has any.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think we are not going to end gender-based violence on the backs of women and girls, right? Like, if we could have ended it, it would be done by now. Like, it'd be over, right? If it only was up to us. But it's not. It takes all of us, and it takes all people to really address this, and not only in Indian country, right? Because we also know that when we look at sexual violence and the harms against our people, there's a lot of non-native perpetrators that are harming our communities. And so we also have to look at how we are working outside of our community as well, and engaging with all people, and all people have a mother, or an auntie, or a grandma that they came from, right? And so if we look at that, and how do we engage and reach people on a level of, like, not wanting to harm our life givers and the people in our communities that are so important. And we have been talking for many years about, women and children are sacred, but what does that actually mean? How do we actually live those values, and what does that mean for other communities as well?
Yeah, this is Ruth. I agree. I think also it comes to everything, you know, echoing what our sister Nicole has shared, and I think of how disproportionately or overrepresented we are in different um, systems, you know, with, you know, foster care to even, you know, our incarcerated relatives in every jurisdiction, and who are, you know, I know Minnesota is a large percentage of Native women incarcerated. And then when we look at, you know, the family structure too of our men, and the overrepresentation of our men who are incarcerated, who are our protectors, but yet, you know, if they're incarcerated, you know, that's just a huge gap within our family structures. So I think of those systems that are there by design to continue the hardships that our people have been facing since time immemorial. But we are strong, resilient people too, and there's lots of hope. Like as you mentioned, you know, our babies, our young ones, the future generations are carrying a lot of the wisdom and heart and love that our ancestors, you know, left all of these values here for us. So, Madzigirads, thank you.
That is really good. So, because my final question was really around that lens of, you know, what are those calls to action, right? What are those things that we want people to, and because once again, we as individuals are not going to be able to solve this issue by ourselves, right? Nicole or Ingrid and themselves are not, like, it's not their responsibility, first of all, but we all do hold a responsibility, nor do we have the power or sphere of influence to create change throughout all of, Turtle Island and in every single community. But we all do play a role. And this is even those who, have never been personally impacted, right, by MMIR. And so we've listed a few kind of the things already, talking about really helping to, push for policy change, pushing for when change happens that things are not just, reports that are on a shelf, that we're actually collectively trying to live those out and holding people accountable to make sure that they are held up, right? As well as some of those individual things that we can do, be it from that Facebook share to those likes and all those sorts of things. But I was wondering if there's any other, either any other calls to actions or things that you'd like people to be, leave the space with?
Mm-hmm. The other thing I think is sometimes we have to get out of the way and let our youth lead us, because we have some really incredible and inspiring young people coming up behind us who are ready to step into leadership, to do great things. And for many years we've had our February 14th event led by our youth in Minnesota and in Minneapolis. And I'm in Pechanga this week, and they have their MMIW walk on Sunday that I will be at. And we've been up on the La Jolla Reservation this week, working with, my daughter is with me, and she's been working with their youth. And they're gonna lead us, right? Like they're gonna take us to places that we haven't been able to get to yet, right? Like they're gonna take us to that next level. And so I think we also have to create spaces for that to happen, and to encourage them, right? And also, as I was meeting with their elders yesterday and thinking about, oftentimes we have also forgotten about our elders' roles in the community, and we are not always going to our elders for guidance. And so how do we create those bridges? How do we listen to, to the wisdom and advice of our elders and our young people, and to create those spaces for all of our community to step in and to lead us to get to the next level. Miigwech.
This is Ruth. I 100% agree, and I don't really have anything more to add. So I just completely echo our sister Nicole's words. So, Madzigirads, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Ingrid, look like you're nodding in agreement with that.
I I'm just honored to be able to continue to learn from both you, Nicole and Ruth, and from Jolene. And I think for me, I just am encouraged to continue to answer the challenge right in front of me, to do the work that's ahead of me in each day, and to keep this wisdom that you've all shared today in the forefront of my heart and mind. Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us today. And I do hope that, not just this week, right? It's great when we are able to have these action weeks, but it's beyond that, right? We need to be doing this day in, day out, and year round. But I do encourage folks, people who happen to be in Minnesota, I know that there's events happening, in both Bemidji and in Minneapolis, as well as in communities all across the country this weekend. And so please just find ways to be in connection with people. And even if not, even if you can't leave your home, but still be thinking and really be kind of doing whatever your role may call you to be. And so we want to thank you all, for listening in, and we do hope that we're able to, continue on with this conversation and this work, and really make it so that we're able to strengthen ourselves as individuals, our programs, our communities as a whole. And so thank you all.
Miigwech. Igawabaman.